Chapter 8. A New Chapter. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of people now rise and take control. Margaret Walker. Anyone who teaches high school students today is constantly reminded that teenagers don't really care how much you know until they know how much you care. Here's something else I've come to recognize. That's true regardless of whatever racial or cultural background they are from. Having a sense of belonging is essential for human flourishing. We witness that time and again among those who feel vulnerable and powerless, like teenagers feeling stuck in schools where they are constantly being evaluated, or people of color who have nowhere to hide from the unpredictable violence of racism. If trauma is passed on in our bodies through generations, then we can't assume all people feel the same sense of belonging in the places we occupy. We need to make a point of expressing genuine love and gratitude for one another, especially to those we suspect may have not heard those words spoken to them in the past. In my work of promoting racial equity in our school communities, I've come to appreciate the very real impact generational trauma has on people. There is an author named Resmaa Menakem, who is a therapist and social worker in the neighborhood where George Floyd was murdered at the hands of police officers on that fateful day of May 25th, 2020. As the global media zeroed in on this incident that had suddenly ignited fury and protests across the world, the work of Resmaa Menakem quickly came to light. A couple of years before the George Floyd tragedy, he had written a powerful book entitled My Grandmother's Hands. He used that image as a way of describing how trauma seeps into our flesh and bones and manifests in our bodies like a memory, haunting our nerves and senses. In his book, Menakem speaks about the psychological impact white supremacy has had on people living in bodies with different skin. He contends that the pathway to mending our hearts is to change the way we relate to our bodies. This act of redefining the narrative around the melatonin in our skin, Menakem argues, is deeply empowering. He goes on to explore how this internal empowerment ripples outward from one body to another, and from groups of bodies into our systems and structures, to eventually transform the very societies in which we live, move, and have our being. I started to look back over my grandfather's life, recalling the ones who tried to offer him compassion and hope, particularly at those times when he would have felt most isolated from the world around him. My mind kept going back to Cassie Maxwell. More than anyone, Cassie stood by my grandfather, sacrificed much, and even risked her own name so that he, in turn, might make a name for himself. I realized my family owed a lot of gratitude for the way Cassie cared for our papa, especially during a time when her own life was hard. I then remembered my father's sentiment about Cassie. We should honor the woman who did as much for our community as the men who fought overseas. I now understood something about what he said. That responsibility rested on me. Of course, it was impossible to express that gratitude to Cassie now. But what about her descendants? Were they aware of the impact she had made on this one person's life? Perhaps a word of appreciation could contribute, even in a small way, to a sense of pride in their own story. After all, as Mannequin pointed out, every redemptive word is like a small ripple that brings healing into the world. Unfortunately, the only record I could find of Cassie's descendants was a great-grandson who died relatively early in life in the midst of a military career. It did appear he had one son who survived him, but I couldn't find any trace of how to contact him. I checked the funeral home website where the great-grandson of Cassie had been buried. I found a tribute page still posted there, along with an email to send words of condolences to surviving members. Given how many years had passed, I wondered if someone was checking this email, or even if it was active. Regardless, I decided I would send my message of gratitude. After introducing myself, I spoke about the relationship between his great-grandmother, Cassie, and my grandfather, George, and how she became a mother to him during his years as a young teenager. When the First World War broke out, I recalled how Cassie signed George's military papers as his, quote, next of kin. This enabled my grandfather to join the only black battalion ever assembled in Canadian history. I shared my father's sentiments, that we often speak of the men of the battalion, but neglect to hold up the women and community who also sacrificed in support of the effort. And since he was the only descendant I could find related to Cassie, it seemed fitting that I should extend my gratitude to him, on behalf of my father's family, for what his ancestor gave to ours, a chance to find purpose in life. Well, I'm not sure if this descendant received my email. I hope he did. Who knows, someday I may have a chance to thank him in person. I've been thinking a lot about all the negative messaging on social media these days, curated by elected politicians who distort the truth with hateful rhetoric that galvanizes their base and manipulates people to follow out of fear rather than a greater faith in the common good. I believe the forms of hatred we witness is fueled fundamentally by greed. We want more from this world than we actually deserve. In turn, we exploit the weak and diminish their humanity in order to justify our actions. From the beginning, racism has always been a means to justify the greed of nations for more land and cheap labor. While, sadly, politicians continue to perpetuate this narrative of superiority through fear-mongering tactics, there is hope. Unlike previous generations, in unprecedented ways, young people today are facing the terrifying outcome of a world driven by greed. And while this is creating tremendous anxiety and fear, youth are demonstrating remarkable courage in voicing a new vision for the future. One day I got a call from my niece, who had recently been hired as a teacher in a school just outside of Toronto. I've been asked to do a student presentation during Black History Month about our ancestor George Dixon," she explained quite excitedly. "They asked me to connect his story to the theme of joy in the outdoors. I think I have an idea I want to run by you." Okay, I thought. This I will need to hear. To be honest, I couldn't see any meaningful connection between joy in the outdoors and what I had spent the previous months learning about my grandfather. But as someone who works in the presence of young people, I'm constantly reminded that they possess something my generation has largely lost: perspective. For starters, it helped that my niece was fluent in French, for she was able to capture the poetic irony of the location in eastern France where the soldiers of the No. 2 Black Battalion were stationed during the war. It was called La Forêt de la Joie, which in English means the forest of joy. I immediately became intrigued as to where my niece was taking this. After we exchanged different ideas, I believe she had come up with an inspiring message for the students. When it came time for her presentation, my niece began by explaining the meaning of the place where my grandfather served in the war, and how despite oppressive conditions, the Forest of Joy still symbolized the place where they came in the hope of achieving freedom from all tyranny. My niece then talked about the many forests and rivers that sustained our ancestors as they escaped from slavery along the Underground Railroad. Then she reflected on the moments when Papa, when he was still young, fled across open waters in search of freedom. "It seems as though adventure," my niece suggested to the students, "was a way for him to escape the all-too-familiar climate of racism that Black Canadians faced every day. I believe the ocean and the great outdoors saved him and gave him a sense of critical hope." Jade was also in attendance on that historic day in Nova Scotia, when the national apology was given. She recalled with the students the inspiring message of Senator Wanda Bernard to continue to imagine and not lose sight of the cost others gave for our freedom. My niece then leaned closer to the mic and placed this thought before the young audience. Imagine. For my great-grandfather, he didn't have the privilege of imagining. He lived it. She pressed on. Throughout your life, I encourage you to keep imagining what life is like to walk through this world as a person of color. I want to invite you to imagine what life was like for my great-grandfather, those he fought with, what they truly fought for, and the cost each of them paid to live in a world where every human could perhaps one day be free. But most importantly, keep this in mind. Imagining leads to empathy. And empathy leads to action. And it is action that leads to change. And bringing her hand over her heart, she closed by saying, "The future begins here."